I'd spent most of my career fighting battles for others, and I'd gotten good at spotting when someone was hiding something. But I never thought I'd need that skill at home. Sarah and I had been married for 15 years. A partnership built on trust, or so I thought. Lately, though, cracks had started to show. Her laughter no longer reached her eyes, and her words felt rehearsed, as if she were reading from a script only she knew. The first clue was minor, a forgotten voicemail on our shared landline. "Hey Sarah, last night was amazing. Can't wait for the next one," the male voice said, casual yet intimate. I replayed it twice, convincing myself it had to be a wrong number. When I asked Sarah about it, she laughed, brushing it off with a wave of her hand. "Spam call," she said, but her voice was strained. Then there were the late nights. Sarah suddenly had endless client dinners and emergency meetings. Once, I tried surprising her at her office with coffee, only to find the lights off and her assistant gone for the night. The tipping point came one evening when she returned home smelling like cologne that wasn't mine. She claimed a colleague had spilled something on her, her tone sharp enough to end the conversation before it started. I wanted to believe her. After all, wasn't I the one too consumed with my work, constantly fighting Medisure Pharmaceuticals and their army of lawyers? Maybe I was overthinking, projecting my own guilt for being an absent husband. But deep down, I knew something was wrong, and I wasn't about to let it slide. Suspicion, it turns out, has a way of creeping into every corner of your life. It starts small, but it grows. Once I let the thought take root, that Sarah might be lying to me, it consumed me. I began to notice everything. The first sign came from a receipt I found stuffed in her coat pocket. It was from an upscale restaurant, the kind we hadn't gone to in years. 2 entrees, a bottle of expensive wine, and a dessert. When I casually asked her about her evening, she told me she'd grabbed a quick bite at a diner with a client. No mention of the restaurant, no mention of the wine. I started checking her phone when she left it unattended, but Sarah was careful. Her call logs were spotless, her messages unsuspicious. Still, no one is perfect, and in her haste, she forgot to delete one thread. It wasn't explicit, nothing so easy to confront her with. But it was intimate enough. Last night felt different. One message read. Another simply said, "I can't stop thinking about you." I didn't recognize the number. My chest tightened. Anger and humiliation clashed with a desperate hope that I was reading too much into this. But the doubts multiplied with every unanswered question, every missing piece. Then there were the unexplained expenses. A hotel charge showed up on her credit card statement. An upscale suite in the heart of the city. When I asked her about it, she didn't flinch. Oh, that was a booking mix-up for a client meeting. The firm reimbursed me. It sounded plausible, but her explanation didn't line up with the timeline of her supposed meeting. The most damning clue came when I noticed a shift in her demeanor around Daniel Tremblay, the firm's managing partner. Daniel had always been polite, even charming in a superficial way, but lately, his interactions with Sarah felt familiar. They exchanged looks across the room that I couldn't quite decipher, and when he thought I wasn't watching, his hand would linger a fraction too long on her arm. One night, unable to shake the growing pit in my stomach, I decided to follow her. She said she was heading to a late meeting at the firm. I waited until she left, then grabbed my coat and tailed her car at a distance. My heart pounded as she turned into the parking lot of a boutique hotel. I parked nearby, watching as she stepped out of her car and walked inside with the confidence of someone who belonged there. 15 minutes later, Daniel arrived. I didn't confront them. Not yet. Instead, I drove home, my mind racing. The evidence was mounting, but part of me still wanted to be wrong. How could I accuse her of betrayal without undeniable proof? What if I misread the situation? But the man I saw at the hotel wasn't imagining things. He wasn't misreading anything. Back at home, I stared at the wedding photo on our mantel, the one where Sarah was laughing and holding my hand as if nothing could ever come between us. I wondered how we'd gotten here, how she had drifted so far away that she could lie to my face, again and again. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in the dark, trying to piece together the threads of her deception. It wasn't just an affair. It couldn't be. There was something deeper at play, something tied to the work I'd been doing and the enemies I'd made. Sarah's betrayal wasn't just personal, it was becoming professional. And if that were true, it meant the stakes were higher than I'd imagined. I wasn't just a husband scorned. I was a man being played, and I had every intention of finding out why. The weight of my suspicions was unbearable, and I knew I couldn't keep living in the dark. If Sarah was lying to me, if she had truly betrayed me, I needed to hear it from her lips. It was late when she came home that evening. Her heels clicked against the hardwood floor as she walked in, her usual breezy, "Hi, honey," echoing in the quiet house. I was sitting at the kitchen table, a glass of whiskey untouched in front of me. "Long night?" I asked, keeping my tone even. She set her purse down and flashed me that polished smile of hers, the one she used to disarm clients and friends alike. "You know how it is," she said. "One crisis after another. I'm exhausted." I didn't respond right away. Instead, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the hotel receipt I'd printed earlier that day, sliding it across the table toward her. Her smile faltered. "What's this?" she asked, picking it up with a nonchalant air that didn't match the sudden tension in the room. "You tell me," I said, watching her carefully. "That's your credit card, isn't it? The one you used to book a suite at the Hotel Andromeda last week." Her eyes flicked to mine, and for a moment, I saw something I hadn't seen in years: fear. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by indignation. "You went through my credit card statements?" she asked, her voice rising. "Seriously, Chuck? That's an invasion of privacy." "I didn't have to," I shot back, my voice steadier than I felt. "It showed up in plain sight. Just like the messages on your phone. Just like the way you've been sneaking around with Daniel Tremblay." Her face hardened. "Are you accusing me of something?" "You tell me," I snapped, slamming my palm on the table. "I've seen the way he looks at you. I followed you to that hotel. I saw him walk in after you. Don't stand there and act like I'm imagining things." Her jaw clenched, and for a moment, I thought she might finally admit it. But instead, she scoffed, crossing her arms in defiance. "You're being ridiculous," she said. "Daniel and I had a meeting there, that's all. We needed privacy to discuss firm business, and the office wasn't an option." "Privacy," I repeated, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "That's the best you can come up with? After everything else?" She threw up her hands. "I can't believe this. You've been so paranoid lately, Chuck. Do you even hear yourself? You're obsessed with your cases, with Medisure, and now you're dragging me into your conspiracy theories." Her gaslighting hit me like a slap. I'd seen this tactic before, in courtrooms, in boardrooms, but it was different when it came from someone you loved. "I'm not imagining this, Sarah," I said quietly, my anger giving way to a deep, aching sadness. "I know what I saw. I know what you've been doing." She stared at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she turned on her heel and walked toward the stairs. "Believe whatever you want," she said over her shoulder. "I'm done with this conversation." I didn't stop her. I didn't have to. Her retreat said more than any confession ever could. That night, as I lay awake in the empty bed we once shared, I realized something important. Sarah wasn't going to come clean. If I wanted the truth, I would have to find it myself. This wasn't just about saving our marriage anymore. It was about saving myself. The days following our confrontation were suffocating. Sarah moved through the house like a ghost, avoiding eye contact and brushing off every attempt I made to speak to her. Our home, once filled with warmth and laughter, now felt cold and hollow. But I wasn't sitting idly by. I threw myself into my work under the pretense of distraction, but in truth, I was digging deeper into the tangled mess I was starting to uncover. My suspicions about Sarah's affair weren't enough to satisfy the gnawing feeling in my gut that there was more to this. It started with Daniel Tremblay. He had always been slick, always charming, but I'd never liked him. Now, I was determined to figure out why he and Sarah seemed so intertwined. I began reviewing old cases we'd worked on together, looking for any signs of misconduct, any hidden threads that might link him to the Medisure case. One night, after hours spent poring over files, I found it, a memo seemingly insignificant at first glance, detailing a settlement agreement between MediSure Pharmaceuticals and a whistleblower years ago. The whistleblower had been silenced, paid off to keep quiet about faulty drug trials that had cost lives. Daniel's signature was on the agreement, along with Sarah's. The room spun as the implications hit me. Sarah hadn't just been cheating on me, she'd been actively working against everything I stood for. She and Daniel had orchestrated the settlement to protect MediSure, the very company I was fighting to hold accountable. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. The late nights, the unexplained expenses, the distant demeanor. Sarah wasn't just unfaithful, she was complicit in a conspiracy to undermine my case and protect a corporation responsible for hundreds of deaths. I couldn't let this stand. But I also couldn't act impulsively. If I confronted her again without solid evidence, she'd twist the narrative, painting me as paranoid and unstable. I needed more proof, something irrefutable. The following week, I started discreetly gathering information. I hired a private investigator, an old friend from law school named Greg, who had a knack for uncovering secrets people didn't want to be found. "Are you sure about this, Chuck?" Greg asked when I explained the situation. "Once we go down this road, there's no turning back." "I'm sure," I said. "I need to know the truth." It didn't take long for Greg to deliver results. He provided photos of Sarah meeting Daniel at discreet locations, restaurants, hotels, even his private office. But it was more than just an affair. Greg found records of Sarah transferring funds into a hidden account, money that appeared to come directly from MediSure. "She's on their payroll," Greg said, sliding the documents across the table. "Whatever she's doing, it's not just about the case, it's about lining her pockets." I stared at the evidence, my stomach churning. It was one thing to suspect. It was another to see the proof laid out in black and white. That evening, I sat in my office, staring at the framed photos on my desk. One was of Sarah and me on our wedding day, her smile radiant, her eyes full of promise. Another was of Ethan, our son, taken during one of his hockey games. I thought about Ethan, about what kind of example I was setting for him. Could I let this betrayal go unanswered? Could I allow Sarah and Daniel to destroy everything I'd built, not just for myself but for the victims I was fighting for? The answer was clear. I couldn't. But I also couldn't let my emotions drive me. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice. If Sarah and Daniel were working to sabotage my case, there was a larger conspiracy at play, one that went beyond personal betrayal. The turning point came when I received an anonymous email late one night. It contained a single line: "They're planning something big. Be ready." Attached was a list of encrypted files, their titles hinting at connections between MediSure, the judiciary, and several high-profile political figures. I didn't know who had sent it, but the information was explosive. If what the file suggested was true, it meant the corruption extended far beyond Sarah and Daniel. It implicated powerful people who had every reason to silence me. That realization was both terrifying and galvanizing. Sarah's betrayal had shattered me, but it had also opened my eyes to the depth of the rot I was up against. This wasn't just a fight for my reputation or even my marriage. This was a battle for the truth, and I was prepared to lose everything to see it through. The morning of my arrest began like any other. I woke up early, determined to comb through the encrypted files I'd received in the anonymous email. Every hour I spent investigating revealed more of the conspiracy, implicating MediSure executives, judicial officials, and even prominent politicians. The deeper I dug, the more it became clear that Sarah and Daniel were just pawns in a much larger game. But I never made it to my office that day. The police arrived just after breakfast. Their loud knock shattered the quiet morning, and I opened the door to find two uniformed officers and a detective standing on my porch. "Charles Moreau?" the detective asked, his tone professional but firm. "Yes," I replied, already feeling the weight of what was about to happen. "You're under arrest for the murder of Judge Philip Stokes. Turn around and place your hands behind your back." The words hit me like a thunderclap. Murder? Judge Stokes? I didn't even know him personally, only by reputation. He was a federal judge known for his strict rulings and integrity, one of the few who hadn't been compromised by MediSure. "There must be some mistake," I said. my voice steady despite the chaos brewing inside me. "We have evidence tying you to the scene," the detective said, his face unreadable. Before I could argue, one of the officers stepped forward and pulled out a pair of handcuffs. I didn't resist as they snapped them onto my wrists, but my mind raced. Who had done this? Why, Sarah. Her name rang in my head like a bell, but I pushed the thought aside. Surely, she wouldn't go this far. Would she? The ride to the police station was a blur. Questions swirled in my mind, but no answers came. When they placed me in an interrogation room, I was left alone for what felt like hours. Finally, the detective returned, a file in his hand. "Mr. Moreau," he began, "we have a witness who claims they saw you leaving Judge Stokes's residence the night of the murder. We also found your fingerprints on a glass in his home. Care to explain?" I stared at him, dumbfounded. "I've never been to Judge Stokes's house," I said firmly. "This is a setup." The detective didn't react, just flipped through the file. "We also have records showing a transfer of $50,000 into your account 2 days before the murder. Looks like payment for a job well done." My heart sank. I had no idea where that money had come from, but the implication was clear. Whoever was behind this had gone to great lengths to frame me. It didn't take long for the news to break. Within hours, every major outlet was running headlines about my arrest. Prominent lawyer Charles Moreau accused of Judge's murder. The accompanying articles painted me as a man desperate to win at all costs, willing to eliminate anyone standing in my way. The fallout was immediate. My law firm suspended me, and clients began withdrawing their cases. Friends and colleagues stopped answering my calls. Only Ethan, my son, reached out, his voice shaky as he asked, "Dad, what's going on? Did you do it?" "No," I said, my voice cracking. "I didn't do it, Ethan. You have to believe me." "I do," he said quietly. "What can I do to help?" His words gave me the smallest glimmer of hope. The first night in jail was the hardest. Sitting in a cold, dimly lit cell, I replayed everything in my mind. Sarah's betrayal, Daniel's involvement, the shadowy forces behind Medi Shore. They had orchestrated this perfectly, turning me into a scapegoat to protect themselves. It was then that I made a vow. I wouldn't let them win. I began reaching out to anyone who might help clear my name. Ethan became my lifeline, visiting regularly and bringing me updates. Through him, I connected with Jenny Boudreau, a brilliant young hacker he had met at university. Jenny's skills were exactly what I needed to start unraveling the digital trail left by my enemies. From my cell, I began formulating a plan. Every day, I pieced together what I knew, using the limited resources at my disposal to identify the cracks in their conspiracy. The turning point came when Jenny unearthed something significant, a series of encrypted messages between Sarah and Daniel, discussing their plan to frame me. The messages didn't outright state their intentions, but the implications were clear. Ethan smuggled the evidence to me during one of his visits. "It's not enough to prove your innocence yet," he said, "but it's a start." I nodded, gripping the papers tightly. "Thank you," I said. "We'll get there." As the days turned into weeks, my resolve grew stronger. They had taken everything from me. My reputation, my career, my freedom, but they hadn't taken my will to fight. This wasn't just about clearing my name anymore. This was about exposing the entire corrupt system that had allowed this to happen. And I wouldn't stop until I succeeded. Jail changes you. At first, the walls close in, and you feel like you'll never breathe freely again. But over time, if you're lucky, or stubborn enough, you adapt. You learn to use the stillness to your advantage. For me, it became a place to think, to plan. Ethan and Jenny kept working on the outside while I worked from within. Every visit brought new pieces to the puzzle. Jenny was relentless, digging deeper into the encrypted files. Each discovery painted a more vivid picture of the conspiracy. Medi Shore Pharmaceuticals wasn't just a corrupt corporation. It was the hub of an intricate web of bribery, blackmail, and murder. One file revealed payments to influential judges, including Judge Stokes, who had refused the bribe before his untimely death. Another showed how Medi Shore had funneled money through offshore accounts to politicians who pushed for favorable legislation. And then there was Sarah. Jenny uncovered a series of bank transfers linking Sarah to a numbered account that matched payouts from MediSure. She wasn't just a passive participant. She was actively facilitating their schemes. Her betrayal cut deeper than any knife. Inside the prison, I began building alliances of my own. Among the inmates were people who had fallen victim to similar conspiracies, whistleblowers who had been silenced, professionals framed for crimes they didn't commit. They became my sounding board, helping me understand the underbelly of the system I was up against. One inmate, a former forensic accountant named Raj, proved invaluable. Raj had been imprisoned for uncovering fraud at his firm, a punishment orchestrated by the same kind of people I was fighting. With his expertise, we analyzed the financial documents Jenny provided, finding patterns and connections that linked the conspiracy's players in undeniable ways. Raj leaned over the papers during one of our sessions, pointing to a series of transactions. "This here," he said, "is the smoking gun. These funds went straight from MediSure to your wife's account. They can't explain this away as coincidence." His words gave me hope. Meanwhile, Ethan worked tirelessly to gather allies. He reached out to former clients, journalists, and anyone who might be willing to listen. One journalist, a young reporter named Claire Hastings, took a particular interest in the case. She saw the potential for a groundbreaking exposé, one that could dismantle the powerful figures behind MediSure. Claire began publishing a series of articles exposing MediSure's history of negligence, corruption, and cover-ups. The articles didn't yet connect to me or my case directly, but they set the stage, turning public opinion against the corporation. Sarah and Daniel's names started appearing in whispers online, their reputations slowly unraveling under the weight of speculation. Then came a break I hadn't anticipated. Jenny managed to track down an old employee of MediSure, a scientist named Dr. Marcus Delaney, who had worked on the clinical trials that sparked the company's downfall. Marcus had fled the country years ago, fearing for his life after blowing the whistle internally. Ethan and Jenny convinced him to return, promising protection and a platform to tell his story. Marcus agreed, providing testimony and documentation that exposed MediSure's deliberate manipulation of drug trial data. When his story hit the press, it sent shockwaves through the legal and corporate world. For the first time, the conspiracy felt vulnerable. Despite the progress, the personal toll weighed heavily on me. Sitting in that cell, knowing Sarah was out there, free and thriving while I rotted inside, was almost too much to bear. One night, Ethan visited with grim news. "Dad," he said, hesitating. "I saw Sarah." I stiffened. "What about her?" "She's moving in with Daniel," he said quietly. I thought you should know." The betrayal felt fresh again, a wound torn open. Sarah had cast aside every pretense of loyalty, throwing herself fully into the arms of the man who had helped destroy our lives. I clenched my fists, trying to steady my voice. "She's made her choice," I said. "Now we make ours." The final piece fell into place when Jenny hacked into MediSure's private servers. She found a recorded video call between Sarah, Daniel, and several MediSure executives, discussing my arrest. "We've neutralized him," Daniel said smugly in the video. "With Moreau out of the way, the case will fall apart." Sarah nodded, her tone icy. "Make sure he doesn't get out. If he starts connecting the dots, we're all exposed." Jenny brought the recording to Ethan, who showed it to Claire Hastings. The reporter's eyes lit up. "This," Claire said, "is the story we've been waiting for." As the pieces of my defense came together, I felt something I hadn't in months: determination. They thought they'd buried me. They thought I was broken. But they'd underestimated me. The day Claire Hastings published the exposé felt like the first crack of dawn after a long, unrelenting night. Her article was a masterpiece of investigative journalism, laying out the entire conspiracy with painstaking detail. MediSure Pharmaceuticals, Judge Stokes's murder, the bribery network, the cover-ups, it was all there, backed by evidence from Jenny's files, Raj's financial analysis, and Dr. Marcus Delaney's testimony. And at the center of it all were Sarah and Daniel. The headlines were relentless. MediSure's web of corruption. How a corporation bought justice and silenced opposition. Lawyer Charles Moreau framed in murder plot. Evidence points to corporate sabotage. It was like watching a dam burst. Public outrage grew with every hour. News stations dissected Claire's article, and social media erupted with calls for justice. The pressure on Medisure and its allies mounted, and soon, the authorities could no longer ignore the evidence. From my prison cell I felt the shift. Guards who once looked at me with disdain now gave me curious, even sympathetic, glances. Fellow inmates approached me with quiet nods of respect. Ethan visited that afternoon, his face alight with hope. "They've reopened your case, Dad," he said, barely able to contain his excitement. "They're starting to realize you were set up." It wasn't freedom, not yet, but it was a start. The legal wheels turned faster than I expected. Within days, I was escorted from my cell to a courthouse, where my lawyer presented the newly uncovered evidence. The judge, faced with overwhelming proof of my innocence and the active role others had played in framing me, had no choice but to order my immediate release. The moment I stepped outside, the world seemed brighter, louder. Reporters swarmed me, shouting questions, but all I could focus on was Ethan standing at the edge of the crowd, tears streaming down his face. We embraced tightly, the weight of months of separation and pain finally lifting. "You did it," I whispered. "You saved me." "No," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We did it. Together." My release wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of the storm. The exposé and the mounting evidence led to a cascade of arrests. Medisure executives were detained, charged with fraud, negligence, and conspiracy. Daniel Tremblay was taken into custody at his firm, his smug demeanor replaced with panic. And Sarah. She tried to disappear, withdrawing large sums from her hidden account and booking a flight out of the country. But she didn't get far. Authorities intercepted her at the airport, and she was arrested on charges ranging from obstruction of justice to conspiracy to commit fraud. I watched the news coverage of her arrest with a strange mix of emotions. Part of me felt vindicated, but another part, perhaps the one that had loved her, felt hollow. She had destroyed everything we had built together, not just for me but for Ethan too. The fallout didn't stop there. Claire's exposé sparked a nationwide reckoning. Whistleblowers and reformers came forward, emboldened by the public's outrage. Investigations into other corporations and judicial figures uncovered further corruption, revealing just how deep the rot went. But it wasn't enough to expose the truth. There had to be systemic change. In the months following my release, I worked tirelessly to establish the Justice Reform Initiative. Ethan and Jenny were by my side every step of the way, their youthful energy and optimism balancing my hardened resolve. The initiative's mission was clear: to ensure accountability within Canada's judicial and corporate systems. We campaigned for new legislation, partnered with investigative journalists, and created platforms for whistleblowers to safely share their stories. Ethan, now studying law, became a passionate advocate for reform. Jenny used her hacking skills to expose hidden corruption, earning a reputation as a digital Robin Hood. Together, we were building something bigger than any of us. One evening, as we sat in the office poring over documents, Ethan turned to me. "Do you think she ever loved us?" he asked quietly. The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken pain. "I think she loved the idea of us," I said after a moment. "But love isn't just about words or moments. It's about choices. And she made hers." Ethan nodded, his jaw tightening. "We'll make ours too. For the better." I smiled, pride swelling in my chest. That's exactly right. The courtroom was packed, the tension palpable as the final verdicts were read. One by one, the conspirators who had orchestrated my downfall and perpetuated the Medisure scandal were held accountable. Daniel Tremblay was sentenced to decades in prison for his role in the conspiracy. His arrogance had given way to desperation as the evidence mounted against him. Watching him stand before the judge, stripped of his power, was a moment I'll never forget. Sarah received a lighter sentence due to her cooperation with investigators, but her life was irreparably changed. She testified against Daniel and others, revealing details of their plans and admitting her role in framing me. As she left the courthouse in handcuffs, she glanced at me. For a moment, our eyes met, and I saw something I hadn't expected: regret. But regret wasn't enough to undo the damage she had caused. With the trials over, I turned my full attention to the Justice Reform Initiative. What began as a small team with big ambitions quickly grew into a national movement. We worked to expose corruption in every corner of the country, from corporate boardrooms to government offices. Ethan emerged as a powerful voice for change. His speeches inspired crowds, and his legal acumen earned the respect of seasoned reformers. Watching him step into the spotlight, I felt a pride that words couldn't capture. Jenny, too, became a force to be reckoned with. Her skills in uncovering hidden truths brought down more than a few powerful figures, and her work earned her recognition as one of the most influential activists of her generation. Together, we created something that outlasted the pain and betrayal of the past. Years passed, and Canada's judicial and corporate systems began to transform. New legislation closed loopholes that had allowed corruption to thrive. Whistleblowers who had once lived in fear found protection and support. The Justice Reform Initiative expanded its reach, inspiring similar movements in other countries. What had started as a fight for my freedom became a fight for justice everywhere. One crisp autumn morning, I stood outside a courthouse, the same one where I had been exonerated. Ethan and Jenny stood beside me, flanked by dozens of activists, journalists, and supporters. We were unveiling the Moreau Center for Justice, a new hub for legal reform and public accountability. The building's gleaming facade was a symbol of hope, a promise that no one would ever have to endure what I had. As I stepped up to the podium, I looked out at the crowd. In their faces, I saw the future, one where justice wasn't just a word, but a reality. "This isn't just my story," I began, my voice steady. "It's our story. A story of resilience, of truth, and of the unyielding fight for what is right. Together, we've proven that no matter how powerful the forces against us may seem, they can be defeated. And together, we'll continue to fight. For justice. For accountability. For a better world." The applause was deafening, but it wasn't for me alone. It was for everyone who had stood up, spoken out, and refused to back down. That night, Ethan and I sat on the porch of my home, the same home where this journey had begun. The air was cool, the stars bright. "Do you ever think about her?" Ethan asked suddenly. I knew he meant Sarah. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but not with anger anymore. She's part of the past. And the past doesn't define us. What we do now, that's what matters." Ethan nodded, a thoughtful expression on his face. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" I smiled. "We have. And there's still so much to do." As we sat in comfortable silence, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The pain of betrayal, the struggle for justice, the fight to reclaim my life, it had all led to this moment. Not an ending, but a beginning.